It's time for a new edition of BWI Live. I'm Greg Pickel. That's Thomas Frank Carr from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T-Frank, Penn State preseason practice hits the midway mark. 2 weeks go in the book as of today on August 14. We were out at practice last night, so we have a lot to dive into on today's show. James Franklin, mostly an offensive theme, assistant and player coach availability on Tuesday night. And then we'll get into your Sunday film study as well. But let's kick it off with this. We're 2 weeks into preseason camp. When you look back at where you were thought process-wise about this team 2 weeks ago compared to now after seeing them a couple times in action, hearing plenty about them once preseason camp kicked off, where are you at with this group moving into the second half of camp and as West Virginia prep starts to kick off for the Nittany Lions?
Are you talking about with just the offense or with the team as a whole?
Just in general. Yep, just in general.
Just in general. Yeah, so I've spent almost no time with the defense. Just the nature of how these open practices go, I haven't had a chance to really get any sort of view of the defense. So I've been focusing mostly on the offense. And something we talked about last week is I honestly think they're putting the receivers through the ringer. They're trying to get as much out of them as possible. I've just been watching that group develop through camp. And what, just in our small view, how they've been trying to progressively get these guys to understand certain parts of the game and how they're improving. And then from the offensive line perspective, we've only seen them do run blocking. So I know it's just a small slice of camp. And getting into some of the things we'll talk about later today, Cooper Cousins comes up, and some of the things that maybe I thought about Cooper Cousins changed with James Franklin's comments yesterday. But at the same time, that group, run blocking, investing in that, I just feel like they've done a lot, and they've been intentional about trying to make this team as physical and as intimidating and as successful up front as possible. And that goes into the scheme and some of the things we'll talk about, but also just generally the mindset and the ability of the offensive line, whoever plays for this team. So I guess just watching what they've been doing on offense, I haven't seen them throw the football at all. Like receivers and quarterbacks throwing more than a yard down the field. It just hasn't happened in front of us. So there is there's still a lot of mystery about what this team is. And I think in the second half of camp, we're going to get a little bit more of specifics heading into West Virginia.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Penn State favored still by about 10.5 points over the Mountaineers for that Week 1 opener on August 31st. T-Frank, let's get into what James Franklin had to say last night. We are getting into a lot of that that some of you are asking about in the comments, so we'll dive into that now. Let's do it.
They have both gotten reps with runs.
All right, it's time to read between the lines on James Franklin's latest news conference. T-Frank, there is no reading between the lines really required for the most newsy item that came out of Tuesday night's availability. Freshman receiver Peter Gonzalez dealing with an undisclosed but coined as long-term, not short-term injury. He's a guy who drew some buzz during preseason camp, both when he arrived from Chuck Losey back during the initial summer workouts in June, and also from James Franklin and some players before and during preseason camp, which of course this was his first one in State College. So really a shame for him, whatever the injury is. Like we said, it's going to be a long-term recovery, not a short-term one. Gonzalez is not new to this. Also, unfortunately, he suffered an ACL tear in 2022 in high school. Again, we don't know the nature of this injury, but I guess the long and short of it is this. The Penn State receivers room brought in Gonzalez, brought in Tysier Denmark, brought in Josiah Brown, who is back from an injury and from his senior season. And there was a lot of good early buzz for Gonzalez. And the read here is, I think, pretty simple. It's that Penn State, if they were going to get a contribution from a freshman in the receiver room in 2024, it's quite obviously now down to either Tysier Denmark or Josiah Brown.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably down to Tysier Denmark.
Right.
Josiah Brown,
Correct.
A bit of a raw prospect because of, again, he had an injury his senior season. So that physical development and kind of, I think as James Franklin talked about, just kind of getting back into football and understanding, how to use his body again at full speed. And it's disappointing because Peter has a lot of talent. And he's a guy that I don't think this year, I was saying he needed to learn how to play the receiver position from a complete perspective because he's the other side of the coin from Tysier Denmark of he is the physical build you want of a guy to come in and participate early. But when you look at his skill set of what he is as a football player, he needed this year to develop. He needed this year to learn and to grow as, how do I get through my cuts and get separation? How do I read this coverage and make sure that I'm getting to the right spot and the right landmark, understanding those things and kind of the defensive concepts coming at him. And now he doesn't have that opportunity. James Franklin, Greg, he said he didn't say season-ending injury.
Right.
He said it's a long-term injury, so he's not going to be out there for a while. But he didn't completely close the door on him coming back at some point. So it makes me think it's not something that's going to be a year-long recovery. But again, that's also speculation. Trying to read between the lines of James Franklin never says something season-ending. He always says like it's a long-term injury. He always leaves that door open. But the way he said it made me think like we might see him practice again late in the year. But I don't know that. That's just kind of reading how he said those things. And the other thing that I, kind of phrasing what could have been, I think, for Peter Gonzalez is that one of the things that James Franklin talked about with Peter is that his dad's a former NFL player. His dad was a quarterback. So he has that kind of institutional knowledge of how to work, how to get better, how to get through the process of improvement. So maybe he would have been a guy at the back half of the season that could get some reps. And I'm not saying push for playing time, but could have seen the field at some point this year if that development continued and he started out pretty strong. And now you don't have that. So that's just an unfortunate thing for Penn State because to me, I understand Tyser Denmark. Everyone's very excited about him. He's got some instincts and some abilities that you can't teach. And he has those kind of those separation skills, that agility, that ability to get open. That's going to play at the next level. But if you're talking about a guy who has the physical ability and could learn in time to do something this year, to me, it was Peter Gonzalez. And now that option is off the table. So it really is, kind of maybe a home run here of Tyser Denmark. And then it's just the guys that are on the roster that we were already expecting. That's who's going to be they're going to rely on this year in that receiver room.
Yeah, no doubt about it. My only thought in regard to Gonzalez and the long-term, short-term impacts of this for him is that when you look back at what James Franklin said endlessly at Big Ten Media Days when asked about numerous Nittany Lions who are injured, he kept saying, well, we expect him back. We expect him back. We expect him back. And he did not say that with Peter Gonzalez. So time will tell. Yep. Obviously, regardless, Penn State dealing with some bumps and bruises. We're going to get into that too. Before we do that, let's go to another James Franklin news conference tidbit. It's coming up here in the chat. I hit the right button, T. Frank. I think the comment popped up, so we're 2 for 2 on that. Eggman, who's the starting right tackle, right guard? Inquiring minds want to know. Well, James Franklin was asked about that very topic on Tuesday night. Not necessarily the starters specifically, but how many offensive linemen could play. Here's what he had to say.
I think we've got a chance to have 8 guys, I think. I think we'll have more than 2 tackles play. I think we'll have at least 3 guards play, and I think we'll have 2 centers play. So how much, we'll see. We still got a ton of work to do between now and then, but I think we have probably a little bit more depth than we've had in the past. So that's a good thing.
You talked about Cooper Cousins last week. Where's he practicing right now, and where do you see him fitting into that picture, whether it's like guard or center?
Yeah, really both. He started out. As you know, typically with young players, you try to keep them at one spot, but he's done such a nice job this spring and done such a nice job this summer camp that we're playing him at both right now. And I think he could legitimately get in the game at both positions.
All right, T. Frank, interesting comments there. And there's quite a bit to unpack, even though that was only about a 50-second clip. The first question I have for you is when you say play offensive linemen, 8 offensive linemen, define for me play, because I think there are obviously various the word is very simple. The context of it here, I think, is very could go in any number of directions.
Well, I put this in here specifically for you because I know you love it when they talk about playing more than 5 offensive linemen and the problem of, do you have 5 if you're playing 8? So I want to ask, just throw it back to you here. Is that do you have some kind of warning signs going off in your head when they're talking about playing 8 guys? And then we can get into kind of what does that mean right off the bat, does that raise your alarm?
No, and here's why.
Okay.
It would have in the past, and it could. I think I could have a different answer on this in a month from now once I see it play out. But I think anymore, T. Frank, you have to look at so many of these news conference answers in the vein of what are they communicating to the players themselves in the era of the transfer portal, in the era of if you lose a position battle, you might not leave right away, but you might leave later on. If so, I think that some of this stuff, and I'm not saying that was necessarily all that's at play here, but I think, to some degree there is that component of it. But, I think we forget sometimes that Penn State mixes up its special teams lines, and some guys get a lot, you'll see they played in 12 and 13 games, and you'll say, well, when did that happen? And it all came on special teams. And so when he says play 8, I don't know necessarily if that's play 8 along the offensive line, or if it's like a combination of guys mixing in on special teams and having the ability to do so, like a Cooper Cousins, who we'll get to here in a second. But, to me, so am I a little bit concerned by it? Sure. I mean, I guess I've always been in the camp. If you go back through the Blue White Illustrated podcast feed or the YouTube channel, you're going to find me saying often that I feel like if you say you have 5, I've come around maybe a little bit on 6, because I think that it does help, especially with you're playing a 17-game season. And that could also be a part of the equation here, too. When you look at we're going to cover this over at Blue White Illustrated a little bit later this week. I'm going off on a tiny bit of a tangent, T. Frank, but I'll bring it back around. If you look at the new SP Plus ratings from Bill Connolly at ESPN, the final ones of the preseason, the one thing you'll learn, Penn State comes in at that at number 6. That's okay, so be it. But if those numbers and metrics end up projecting properly to the season, Penn State's going to be a huge favorite in a lot of games. And I'm just not convinced you're going to have to play your starters at any position much in the second half. So I think that's another area to think about this too when you talk about 8 guys playing on the offensive line. Okay, well, if the first 5 play the whole first half and then the games, I don't know, like Bowling Green and Kent State are brutally bad. So if Penn State's up 45-0 at halftime, you can mix and match pretty confidently there. But you might not do that against Ohio State or at USC. So, I think that's sort of the context of that quote. Yeah, they have 8 guys that they feel can play and they can win a Big Ten game with, but different Big Ten teams are going to dictate different, combinations and rotations along the offensive line. But speaking of Cooper Cousins, I know everyone's excited about him. He came up again. Yeah, go ahead.
Before we get to that, Greg, I want to make sure we get to this right away because it is something that I think is really important for the season overall, and that is Rogue Shop. Are you somebody who struggles to wind down after a football game? After all, primetime games end at 12:30. Your emotions are super high, and then you want to join us on the postgame show. And I'm here yelling at you and telling you all these things, and I'm super excited, and then all of a sudden it's 1:30 in the morning, and you got to go to bed because you got to get up the next day. Maybe you have kids. Maybe you want to go to do something with your Sunday, and you're a zombie because you didn't sleep at all last night. You sit there and you just spin when you're in bed. Well, RogueShop.com can help you out. They are a husband and wife cannabis store that have been working with us for quite a while now here on the BWI Live Show. We're happy to have them back here for August. They sell CBD, THC, Delta-9, and a bunch of other different variants in those strains. I use their, they're called Slap Yo Mama. They are some serious stuff. Now, I take like a corner of one a night to fall asleep. Stay asleep throughout the night, wake up refreshed so that I can sprint through the next day and get you as much of this Penn State football information as you can handle. So RogueShop.com, but it's not just, that's just what I know. And I don't know a whole lot about this. Let me just be clear about that. They send me products based on, I said, hey, here are the things. And they said, all right, we're going to send you this. Try that out. Find your dosage. They help you out with all that stuff, but they know the stuff. And they have a chat on their site. So Shar or somebody else is going to answer your questions if you've got any about what you need, what you're looking for. They've got CBD as well for pain and inflammation, anxiety, stress, chronic illnesses, whatever it is that you're dealing with. RogueShop.com has something that can help you out. So appreciate them supporting the show. It's a little behind the scenes today. Greg is running things fully for the first time ever. And so like when he's saying he's pushing the buttons, like I'm just sitting here, but he doesn't like we have certain obligations we have to get to within a certain time frame. And I looked up at the clock and I was like, I was just hanging out. La, da, 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 da. I was like, oh no, we're up against it, Greg. So I apologize for hijacking, but we're back on track.
Yeah,
Cooper
no
Cousins,
problem at
right?
all. Thanks to Rogue Shop. Yep, thanks for Rogue Shop for supporting Blue White Illustrated. Thanks for you supporting Blue White Illustrated, listening along with us today or watching on YouTube. Yeah, Cooper Cousins. I mean, I think we've heard so much about him, and anytime James Franklin is asked, he's been willing to allow that, the things that we heard from the spring are certainly, at least in some respects, carrying over to preseason camp. I'm sure there's been days where he looked like a freshman or he played like a freshman, whatever you want to call it. But without a doubt, he seems to be one of the guys in the mix of that 8-man rotation. James Franklin saying recently it would be hard to keep him off the field. Like we heard there, they're playing him at center and guard so far in preseason camp. So pretty interesting to see how his season progresses. I mean, James Franklin, I'll cover this in, I think a little bit more depth later, but saying that no decisions have been made on how many freshmen are going to burn a red shirt versus not burn a red shirt. And again, I think when it comes down to it, they're with the 4-game rule. So I saw some questions about this on the Lions Den message board. I think it was last night. It was sometime recently. But just to be clear, even though the postseason format has changed with 12 teams and more games, your redshirt year technically is still, if you play more than 4 regular season games, you burn your red shirt. If you play in 4 regular season games, you preserve a year of eligibility. And it makes no difference if you play a single snap in the postseason or if your team goes to the national title and you play every single game. So that's going to be a part of this too. But Cooper Cousins, you talk about guard and center. Do you think it's notable that they're cross-training him at both? To me, my initial reaction was, well, that's what they do with a lot of these guys. But not every guy's a freshman. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, they're treating him like a veteran in that sense of, and James Franklin talked about it in that quote, where normally you keep a freshman at one place, but he's able to handle so much, we've been able to cross-train him. So he took reps in the spring at center. And then we didn't really see him at center again because they started him in at guard. So I think between the two, sure, he can play center, maybe against Bowling Green, as you mentioned, but in games that matter, in situations that matter, if he sees the field, I think it's going to be at guard. Because I asked James Franklin back in the spring, like, can you play 2 centers? You can play 2 guards. You can sometimes play 2 right tackles, but you really don't ever see anybody platoon at left tackle or at center. Right. So it's not a situation where he's going to come in and be a part-time starter or a co-starter at center. Right. And since camp has started, they have been putting Vega Yuan at center, not Cooper Cousins. So I think while it's true, to me the real thing is he's going to play guard. He's going to be primarily when we see his reps and his snap distribution outside of some of those blowouts you mentioned. If he sees the game during any contest that is not in doubt, it's going to be at guard. But it's also interesting, Greg. He said we could play up to 8 offensive linemen. And you mentioned it, I think, properly of like, what is the context of play? When are they playing? But there's 9 guys that we can think of right now. Drew Shelton, Javen Williams at left tackle, right? James Franklin said Javen Williams has earned to be in the conversation to see some snaps this year. Right. Left guard, Vega Yuan and JB Nelson. Center, Nick Dawkins. Right guard, and I'm just putting Cooper Cousins here for now. Right guard, Sal Wormley, the starter to answer Eggman, and Cooper Cousins. And then right tackle, you've got Donko and Rucci. Now, I'm not great at math, but that's 9, right? Right. So maybe you're playing 8, but who's left? Who in that equation is not in the 2 deep at the moment that you're saying can play? I think in Big Ten games that matter and in those games that you really like, we got to win this game, they'll pare it down to like 6, maybe 7. They'll have that 6 offensive linemen, but 8 guys, maybe 9 guys can play this year. It's really about who's in the starting 6. And to me, it's down to Javen Williams, JB Nelson, if he's healthy. We don't know necessarily fully where he is right now. And then he's been there, I should say. He has been there. He's been practicing. He is participating in everything we've seen. It's just I am not going to believe it until he steps on the field, Greg, because he has been injured for most of his time at Penn State. And then you've got Anthony Donko, Nolan Rucci. So, you've got 3 primary guys fighting for a 6th spot. I don't know who that guy's going to be in terms of the actual, meaningful plays during meaningful reps.
Right, and I think that's what James Franklin was getting at when he said they still have a lot of work to do. That right tackle battle between Donko and Rucci continues. Again, I think I'm probably in a camp right now of having to see Nolan Rucci as passing Anthony Donko in pregame warmups at West Virginia to believe that's going to happen, but it seems like that one's closer than expected. Both of those guys certainly, and as we saw last year, will play, and as we saw last year, the right tackle spot is one that Penn State feels comfortable rotating. But you're right, left tackle center, a little bit of a different story. Anything else from James Franklin yesterday, T. Frank, before we move on to some other thoughts from Tuesday's media availability? Anything else jump out at you from his time with reporters on Tuesday night?
Nothing that we're not going to get to next. And you wrote your 4 things, and I think there's something in there that I was interested in that we can talk about that.
All right, let's roll ahead into that segment of the show. By the way, it's a good time now as you're listening to the Wednesday, August 14 edition of the BWI Live Show. Hit that like button and subscribe. Leave us some feedback if you are willing or able. There you go, T. Frank. I was able to get that part in on time, and we appreciate everybody being on board with us here today. So I guess let's lead off the bidding here, T. Frank. Let's mix this up a little bit from the rundown we have. I want to start with the Andy Kotelnicki stuff because I thought that was some of the more entertaining, thoughts that were out there from yesterday. He has such an interesting personality that it's hard to ignore sometimes. I was standing over on another part of the Haluba Hall turf talking to Drew Allar, and you can just hear Andy Kotelnicki booming in the background. I mean, he has such a distinctive voice that sometimes you're listening to Drew Allar, but you catch yourself overhearing some of what Andy Kotelnicki had to say. Let's start with and we can just wrap up this part of the show in terms of offensive line talk, unless we get some stuff in the chat. But let's go to Andy Kotelnicki on the offensive line first.
Yeah, I think I've talked before, maybe early in my first press conference, of just that the development of them has been very obvious as a group. Credit to Coach Trout, Coach Leonard, Coach Q, and Sticks to do that, because to his point, if you were to say who's lineman number 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, there'd be some questions about trying to figure it out. So that's good that there's a lot of healthy competition there. How it looks, I think that's a position where when you have depth, that really shows up through the course of a season. And so to intentionally get guys into the game, either rotating in, by series or whatever it might be, to make sure that they're getting playing time and that you have a chance to continue to evaluate them as the season's going on. But then they're also getting playing time for when they do need to play a significant amount, that they're ready to go.
So pretty much what we had just covered moments ago. Anything extra to add on that, T. Frank?
Just that he said who's 4, 5, 6, and that might have just been the way he phrased that. But if they don't have 5 guys that they think right away, right now, that's where I'm like, why I asked you off the top, like, is this a concern if they don't have 5 guys, even though we're talking about they have 8, maybe 9 guys that they like? And that is kind of the nature of this offensive line, is that they are deep of talented players that don't have a lot of experience. So, from the outside, it can go a lot of different ways. But which ways are it going? And that's one of those reasons you should subscribe to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. So when our insiders get information and they can get these conversation points and some of the things we're not saying here right now about the offensive line, some of the situations that are going on, our guys have been reporting on that. Subscribe, 2 months for $1, code PSU1. You get that because you love us here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. We have the #1 Penn State football talk show anywhere on the planet, and it's because of you, and we want to give you this opportunity to join us full-time at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com with code PSU1, whether you're on the podcast or on the YouTube channel. We love you. Thank you.
Awesome. T. Frank, we got a super chat, which you can also help BlueWhiteIllustratedOut.com with those. Thank you, C. Paul King. Question that comes along with that, and T. Frank was right. We've been doing this show for a long time together, and he always tells you guys that when you send a super chat, it pops up in big, shiny, flashing, bright letters. It does. It actually does. So that's good to know. Question, what about Alex Birchmeier? Still developing. I mean, he's a guy that when you look at this offensive line picture, not in that 8-9 area right now, and that's okay. I mean, I think when you look at the number of players out, I think there may be a small group that wants to look at what Cooper Cousins is doing and say, oh, well, Birchmeier must be so far behind because Cousins is already being talked about and Birchmeier's not. And I just look at it as it's a very veteran offensive line, despite losing 3 starters from last year, which is kind of weird to say. But when you think about where Penn State's at as a program, that's one of the reasons that I think to me, there's a little bit of a not enough focus on this offensive line and what it'll be like in the first game of the year, just in terms of the questions that remain. But I will say this. I think that, they have a good group they feel strongly about, and it's a lot of veteran guys. So I would not worry about Alex Birchmeier just yet. Any other thoughts on that, T. Frank?
Just if you don't hear a guy's name coming up, nothing's coming up. So, that's kind of an indication of if we're talking about a guy who is down the depth chart, if James Franklin brings up a guy down the depth chart, like here, Jackson Smolik is injured, but he's been saying how impressed he's been with Jackson Smolik doing certain things. So if we don't bring up a guy or James Franklin doesn't bring up a guy, that means there's probably not a whole lot that has changed to really give you an update. So that's just kind of a stock answer of what about Alex Birchmeier? And it's at this point, what about him? He's a redshirt freshman who's trying to grow and develop and kind of get back on a path of development, I think is just, where he is right now in that of we've been, I think, a little bit skewed by the other players around him, Anthony Donko and Cooper Cousins.
Javen Williams. Yeah, Cooper Cousins, yes. Cooper Cousins and Javen Williams as well.
Yeah, and Javen is a little bit behind those guys in terms of we're talking about him now, but he wasn't a guy that shot out of a cannon like Anthony Donko or Cooper Cousins. That's not the normal progression for an offensive lineman to come in at 320 pounds. Birchmeier, there's been some retooling and reshaping, lower body strength. He talked about that when we talked to him this winter where he had to really work on that. And then honestly, they've moved him a couple of times trying to find the right spot for him. So right tackle early on, moved him in the guard. The last couple times I've seen him, he's been at left guard. And not that there's a huge difference between those two, but there are some subtle differences. So finding a home for him in that progression is also, I think, part of the conversation. Where does he fit best?
All right. C. Paul King, thank you for the question. If you have a super chat question for us, feel free to hit that button and go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next part of Andy Kotelnicki's news conference that caught both T. Frank's and I's ear. That's how to generate explosive plays. I just think it's funny that this came up because I'm looking at the chat, T. Frank, and I can't control F at the moment, but if I did, I think the chat and the word explosive would probably equate to most of the comments out there. So let's hear from Andy Kotelnicki, the first-year Penn State offensive coordinator, on that very topic.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is how do you mitigate risk and still be explosive, right? You know what I mean? Well, it goes with design. It goes with some intentions about what explosive plays look like and are. Obviously, people think about explosive plays and think about shots down the field, perhaps, and that might be part of it, but that's not going to be all of it, right? So the intention of maybe setting up plays that are complementary, the intention of putting your players in their best position possible to succeed, and the intention to make sure that you are pressing the ball down the field enough.
But Greg, before we get into anything, I just want to say, I'm going to give you a caveat. I absolutely love having Andy Kotelnicki on camera. He is interesting, he's dynamic, but he's probably from a I need to capture him in this box, he's a little too dynamic. Yesterday, at one point, he's swinging his hat around while talking, and then, as somebody who had Italian grandparents, I'm used to talking with my hands. You see it here on the show all the time. But, keeping it in the frame, he's over here talking, he's over here talking. So it's just if you see the video on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel, I'm doing my best to keep him in the middle of the frame. I just wanted to start with that.
Yeah, easier said than done. But, he went on shortly after that. You asked him a question, some other reporters did, on that explosive play line. There's a story out. There's multiple stories out across the beat this offseason talking about explosive plays. We've talked about it as much as the receivers and the offensive line. But one other thing he said that we didn't capture in that clip, obviously Penn State, T. Frank, judges explosive plays 12 yards or more for a run, 15 yards or more for a pass. Andy Kotelnicki saying he wants Penn State's goal to be around 15% in game, noting that plenty of things can skew that percentage, like turnovers or one big play touchdown. So it's not a perfect number by any means, but I'll let you get into the sort of the X's and O's. The big thing to me after listening to him multiple times now between the time he was hired and now is that he knows he was brought in to do this job, and the biggest maybe factor of it outside of bringing Drew Allar along with help from Danny O'Brien was bringing an offense that Drew Allar and the receivers and the running backs and the tight ends could be explosive in. And that is by, I don't know if there's another metric that James Franklin's going to be judged on for this hire, or that Andy Kotelnicki is going to be judged on for how he performs and his offense performs in 2024.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think in that quote he talked about, and what I wanted to get into here is how you generate explosive plays without, as he said later, just people are playing off and you're chucking it down the field. And just it's not just chicks dig the long ball when it comes to explosive plays. A run of 12 yards is a great run. That's not like a game changer, but like when you stack those in a game, the whole point of explosive plays is if you get an explosive play on a drive, your chances of scoring go up exponentially. Again, This is all data-driven. This is all what have we seen and we've recorded over the history of football where we've been observing these things. So it's not like I'm arguing with the anti-data crowd, but it's not like this is just numbers. This is people have watched football. Experts who know football watch football, and they go, okay, what equates to winning the most? Scoring points. What equates to scoring points the most? Explosive plays. And if you get above that threshold of 15%, you score a lot of points because you get enough explosive plays to get enough points. And it doesn't have to be a 40-yard touchdown on every single play. But that was exactly what Penn State was missing last year, where they got a certain number of explosive plays, but they didn't result in big touchdowns. And so that's a whole tangent aside from the point that I wanted to make originally, which is he talked about complementary plays and chaining things together, making them look the same. And that's about making the defense wrong. It's not even about your team's talent. Like, we're going to get into speed and combinations of players on the field, but also forcing the defense to make an oopsie, and then suddenly you get an easy explosive play. That's a lot of what his offense is based on, and we've talked about it, as you mentioned, all season at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. So he said it yesterday, and like it doesn't matter how many times everyone else says it. Once he says it, it becomes real. Like, that's the thing they're doing. So I think it was important to underscore that catch and run, the talent they have on this team of putting a player in position to succeed with their talents is what he's going to do. And that doesn't mean that they need to throw the ball 60 yards down the field through the air and let Drew Allar be Peyton Manning. It's very different year to year based on what talent you have. And if the talent changes over time, the offense will look different because you accentuate different parts of the playbook to put those guys in a position to succeed. So the explosive plays beyond the numbers of the X's and O's, how you do it, this is an offense that is built entirely on complementary plays, chaining things together and making everything look the same so that when you do take a shot, the offense or the defense thinks you're running the football or you're throwing a different pass pattern.
Right.
And that's how that's how they're going to go about doing that this year. That's what they did at Kansas and Buffalo and all the places he's been.
Yeah, there's no question about that. This offense is predicated on this is a silly way to put this, I think, but being predictably unpredictable. And you're going to see a lot of the same stuff pre-snap until you don't, until motion this or route that or something along those lines that makes the defense think something is coming to you, Frank, and I'll let you take it from here, but it really isn't.
Yeah, just throw Bane Train's comment here up in the chat because I want to respond to this because this is a fair point. And we're going to get to kind of this half of the conversation next with what I asked Andy Kotelnicki, because it is important. Speed is important. His one about Tyreek Hill, actually.
You got it. Yep.
This one here. He says, Tyreek Hill is the most explosive player in the NFL, and the reasoning is obvious. He's fast as hell and can catch on the move. I think scheme only takes you so far. That's correct. But two things here. Tyreek Hill is a unicorn. He started out at Oklahoma State as a running back. So that's just a different breed of player. Secondly, he's also a player that can take a catch and run and be explosive with it through scheme. You can throw him a slant and he'll go 75 yards. He literally is a threat at every level of the field because of his route running and his not just speed, but his agility and strength through contact. People don't give him enough credit for the fact that he's a tank. He's like 5'9", 200 pounds, but he runs as fast as he does. So first off, unicorns exist, and we can't always point to the unicorn, Bane Train, although you are right. That is an area where this particular offense, that's what we're going to get into next in terms of what is the talent on the field, and what's the combination of ingredients that you're making?
All right, let me pull that up here. Andy Kotelnicki on that very topic. Here we go.
Yes, to your point, like you can't have a bunch of slow people, right? And you can't have a bunch of just really fast, weak people, right? So when you think about complementary people, I think maybe more about putting them out there to do the things that they do well. Right? So if we have an elite speed player, put him in position to utilize his elite speed. If we have a great change of direction or physical, whatever, receiver, put him in a position to do that. If you have a tight end who's better at blocking versus receiving, put those guys in positions. I know that sounds cliche, like, yeah, Doug, coach, I play Madden and then the new college 20 football game, so I know how to do that. But actually getting players to execute those things, and more importantly as coaches, to reflect and really have enough evidence to feel confident in saying that this player can do this really well. He'll be able to do that for us on Saturdays.
It's a great line, T. Frank. It's one thing to say you know what needs to happen to be explosive and score points, which a little later in that clip, if we had let it keep playing, Andy Kotelnicki was going to say the bottom line is you have to score points, and that is the bottom line. And you can know that. Everyone knows that. That is no secret. That is no surprise. But it's one thing to know that, and it's another thing to, A, have the scheme that can allow it to happen, B, then put the players in the right position to do so, and then C, they go out and execute.
Yeah, so there's a lot of conversation in the chat about, talent being the main factor here. And yes, that is absolutely true. This is the thing I keep coming back to with this offense. They'll have to throw the football at some point when everyone knows they're going to throw the football. And they don't have Caden Wallace and Olu Fashanu back there anymore. So let's set aside the offensive skill players for a second. That's a real thing with Drew Allar and his tendencies to struggle under pressure. All of this about speed, deep shots doesn't matter if they can't protect in obvious passing situations. But then when you are crafting an offense to try and avoid that, what are you using? What are the ingredients that are out there on the field? And this is my analysis of what they have. The fastest tight end on their roster is a slow receiver. Their slowest receiver is a fast tight end. Running backs typically play in the middle of the football field. So you've got guys that produce the same thing at the same time. So I asked him, and we didn't get into this one, and I'm going to write about all these things and kind of go through some of the combinations in detail and some of the pain points that this offense has at the moment. The combinations, there's not a whole lot that produce a balanced attack that have speed, size, strength, all the things that can defeat any situation because they're going to face teams that have different strengths and weaknesses. So right now, and the whole point of this is that there's been a lot of over-the-middle stuff with Penn State's talent, and last year they tried to throw the ball outside the numbers to avoid turnovers. Andy Kotelnicki's scheme can open up the middle of the field for the offense, sure. But if you don't have any threats out wide, you can only open up the middle of the field so much. Like, the threats are the threats, and they are where they are. He went on to talk about diversifying your skill sets, and to me this means Nick Singleton has to be able to be a receiver this year. Not just he's improved as a route runner, right? But if you're talking about dudes who have game-breaking speed, there's one guy on this team that has game-breaking speed who's in the starting lineup. The conversation then about receiver comes down to Amari Evans, Caden Saunders, some of those guys that have speed. And he mentioned, like, you don't want to put a bunch of weak, fast people out there who can't beat press coverage. Like, you need to have a balance of threats. And your top two receivers that have separated themselves from the pack are Liam Clifford and Trey Wallace. Both those guys I characterize as fast enough. So these are the pain points for the offense that I guess I'm trying to point out here is throwing the football and getting those explosive plays over the top to complement, because if you're only throwing catch and run and trying to get guys to break tackles, eventually teams can still creep up, right? They can still flood the middle of the field, flood the underneath coverage, and not allow you those opportunities. So the combination of the skill players out there matters. So Julian Fleming on the field doesn't solve this problem, and that's kind of where all of this comes from is Penn State fans, former 5-star, comes from Ohio State. Everyone's expecting him to come out and solve all the problems. He is going to be a player that Andy Kotelnicki is going to put in position to succeed. He is a physical receiver. He's a great route runner. He gets open versus zone coverage. He can do certain things running away from other players, but he is not a guy that's going to solve these problems. So the combinations that they have right now, they still have to find the right group that is the best unit, the most balanced unit to put out there.
Right. And I think the big thing to me at this point, and I'm going to write about this over at blueillustratetelater.com today, but I am very much at the moment, my train, if my line of thinking is comparable to an Amtrak train, I am fully stopped at the station of seeing will be believing with this group, because you hit the nail right on the head. I think that the way Andy Kotelnicki groups players on the field, and then the way he schemes to get them open, and then Drew Allar's ability to maximize that as the quarterback is going to tell the story of this offense one way or the other in 2024. And it's great to keep hearing about it. And Drew said that he feels like the offense is, and we're going to get into this for a second, able to bounce back to adversity better and things like that. And everything they're saying is what I think Penn State fans should want to hear. I am just very much at the seeing is believing point. Mm-hmm. And I think when you envision all the things you can see with Andy Kotelnicki, if you see all of them, T. Frank, his offense is going to be a problem for a lot of opposing defenses. Yeah. It's just all the questions you just laid out, and all the questions that are in the chat, and have been in the chat, and have been in the BWI chat over at blueillustrated.com for months now. This is nothing new to anyone. The question for me is just, what does this look like on game day? And how does Andy Kotelnicki bring some of these guys to a place where they can maximize their strength, whereas last year it was clear to everyone in my mind that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, and so Eggman says, I don't really see any weaknesses in this offense, even at wide receiver, and there is a path for that to happen, right? So I think Trey Wallace is an NFL receiver. His composite skill set is a guy that can play in the NFL. Liam Clifford is a good receiver. He's a guy that I think if you compare them at a really high level, those two guys are kind of similar. They do everything pretty well. I'd say Wallace is a little more explosive, he's been more explosive through contact. So he has, I think, that more dynamic, as opposed to Liam Clifford, who's more of the route running savvy, maybe not as physical, even though he's a big body guy that can be. And if the light has come on for him there, they have two guys that I think work really well as all-around receivers. But if you're saying there are no weaknesses, this is, I guess, the conversation of, we get into the shut up nerd category when we come into football where I'm talking about these things. If you don't want to acknowledge there are weaknesses to the offense because they've got enough talent overall to overcome most situations, that's fine. But they are going to come up against a team where they need a deep threat, where the weakness is, hey, these corners are bad in double moves, or they have a weakness where you can get them against the safety, and that guy has to get open because that's our best opportunity for an explosive play. And if those guys aren't working out and they don't have that element in the offense, then you can put this offense in a corner. I could design something that would put them in a box in terms of if I'm a defensive coordinator.
Yeah, it's called 2023, the Penn State 2023 offense. We're going to throw everyone in the box. And speaking of the box, that just made me think of it. We're going to throw everyone in the box, and good luck running it because you're not going to be either willing or able to throw it.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's kind of the main point through all of this is like they need to find balance in the offense that is beyond just good players on the field, which is the number one thing. But then the number two thing is, what happens when you go up against a situation where you need something a little different? And right now I see a lot of cinnamon. I don't know that I see a lot of sugar. And if you're baking an apple pie, you need both.
Rob Sherrill making a fair point that Penn State opponents, many of them, in fact, have new schemes and new guys they have to work into. Totally fair point, and a lot of it is especially on the offensive side of the ball. And, of course, Penn State should have strength on defense. Go ahead, T. Frank.
No, it's training camp, so we're focused on Penn State. And we're focused on these things that are in our face. And that's kind of the situation that we're talking about. So, yeah, absolutely, there are other teams. In fact, that's what we're going to close the show on, is talking about another team and what I saw from them last year. Because, there are certain situations where you're going up against a team that is not in a strong point from their personnel matching what they want to do.
Right, there's no question about it. Well, before we get to that, a couple more things from Tuesday's Penn State availability. Thanks for listening to the BWI live show here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube page and podcast feeds. T. Frank, bumps and bruises and physicality has been another talking point, not just throughout this preseason camp, but throughout this show as well. We mentioned Peter Gonzalez off the jump, freshman receiver dealing with a long-term injury. James Franklin asked about I guess it was 3 specific players. No, 2, but a third actually works into the mix. Ask about the third. Well, he said the third receivers. There's been some bumps, third running backs. Excuse me, been some bumps and bruises there. Then asked specifically about Quentin Martin. Noted bumps and bruises have kept him not as healthy as he would probably prefer, or active as he would prefer to be during training camp. Same deal with Cam Wallace, who is a second-year Nittany Lion. Quentin Martin, a first-year Nittany Lion. Those two competing for the third running back job. And then he had the same response when asked about Khalil Dinkins' bumps and bruises affecting availability. We have heard, and Penn State is proud of the fact that they run a very physical camp. James Franklin saying, again, and this is not the first time he has said this, T. Frank, that when they hire new people, they sometimes are surprised by how physical camp is. Not all bumps and bruises can be blamed on being physical and tough in training camp. Some, I'm sure, certainly can, though. And so it's a balancing act as Penn State tries to instill toughness and physicality into its 2024 team, but also make sure as many guys as possible get to game day and are ready to go.
Yeah, and so I asked him about that in terms of physicality, because it's not just here. Like during the spring, if you consume all Penn State media, he went on the Adam and Brenneman podcast with Christian Hackenberg and discussed what their plan was in the spring. And I'm going to read the quote. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read you the quote here. If you want change, you must change. The definition of insanity: do the same thing over and over and expect different results. We've had probably our most physical spring ball. We didn't really back off. We met with the Leadership Council 2 weeks ago. To be honest with you, they were kind of pushing back. Hey, we've been very physical this training camp. You talk about a long season, possibly 17 games. We're going to have to be strategic about it after the team got bumps and bruises in the spring. And he said, and his response was, and I said, yeah, but on the same hand, you got to be willing to do those things that we haven't done before. So Penn State is full steam ahead through all of these bumps and bruises. And there's more to the quote. There's kind of more to this context, but bumps and bruises are a part of football, and if you're constantly managing that and not still working, you can always say next man up, right, Greg? But if you don't do next man up, then you don't necessarily get the results that you're looking for. And I think that's, if I'm trying to interpret what James Franklin is saying, because I asked him about physicality, and he said we're always physical. And yet there's this conversation point of more physical than it was last year or in years past, and how are you dealing with that? And it seems like that's kind of the end result of what they're doing.
Yes, that's exactly right, T. Frank. And I think that at the end of the day, for Penn State to get to where it wants to go, it's no different than any other part of the offseason conversation. They have to be at their best against Ohio State and against the best teams on their schedule. Well, this year, that's Ohio State. And at their best means physically in the trenches. At their best means physically when tackling. At their best means explosive as an offense. So no matter what way you want to describe it, that's pretty much, I think, the end-all, be-all to me. That is the biggest takeaway of this offseason so far. In every interview James Franklin has done, is we need to be our best, and best is all of that stuff rolled into one against the best teams on our schedule. So, I think that when you get into that physicality thing, there is a fine line, but for Penn State to do what it wants to do, it has to be at its physical best, its mental best, and obviously its execution best to beat those teams on the schedule. One last thing before we get into the Sunday film review. I know this is always a topic that is top of mind for Penn State fans, so I wanted to point it out. No red, yellow, green decisions yet for Penn State freshmen who are a part of the class of 2024. That question came up in response to, or follow-up rather, in response to an answer James Franklin gave about what tight end Luke Reynolds has done so far. Obviously, Cooper Cousins came up during Tuesday's news conference and also plenty throughout this show. So if you think that those guys coming up means the red, yellow, green decision has been made, we're just not there yet. And I think I think
we're there with Cooper.
I think so. Probably too.
I think we know what Cooper's status is, but outside of that, fair point.
I would say so, except for the fact that, again, I just look at this. I'm having a hard time marrying. I think yes, in all likelihood, yes, I completely agree. But I keep thinking back to this whole we could play 17 games thing, and what does that? How does that change this conversation compared to what it did in past years? that's not just this year. I mean, so when you talk about your freshmen, how are you going to maximize their time at Penn State, but also realize that they could play more games than guys before them did? If they're only 3-year guys, they could still play more than some guys did in 5 years. So it's a very interesting question to consider.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. By and large, Cousins looks to be as about green as green can get in the green, yellow, red, because he did not show up to campus green in terms of not being ready. And certainly he has only taken steps forward since.
I like that.
Sorry,
I'm not gonna. You ended that on a fine point, so I don't have anything else to say.
All right, time for the Sunday film study. It's BWI Live.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about Wisconsin today.
Yep.
And this is a very high-level discussion. Like, even the film study, I was like, there's a lot of, like, basic things that we need to get on the same page about when it comes to Wisconsin football. It is not your father's Wisconsin anymore. And I know some people know that. But a lot of people check in with teams when Penn State plays them. So the last time Penn State played Wisconsin was 2021, and they were a ground and pound, physical, big body defensive line, attack with outside linebackers, old school 3-4 defense, and a I formation, fullback, multiple tight end, student body right offensive line. Luke Pickel has changed the program completely. And I don't mean that in a hyperbolic sense. Everything about this team from a schematic standpoint is completely different. So everything you know about them, if you look at the red and white and the offensive line and think those are all future NFL linemen, that is not, I mean, maybe, but that is not the case with this particular group, especially last year, watching some of the evaluation, and that's not really the point of this, Greg, to evaluate last year's offensive line, but it is a situation where that offensive line was put in a bad situation. They were those guys that were ground and pound, momentum going forward offensive linemen, and then they had to play in a 2-point stance, and they threw the ball a lot. So everything you know about Wisconsin, wipe it off the table, and we'll get into who's the new Wisconsin over the next couple of weeks, including how Tom Allen beat that team, which is going to be our next Sunday film study coming up next weekend.
Yeah, pretty interesting to me, Wisconsin. Luke Pickel, I don't remember where I saw this article. It may have been on the on3.com homepage, but somewhere across the internet, Luke Pickel was basically asked, how long is it going to take you to defeat this mindset of, and roster construction, quite frankly, of, what old Wisconsin was compared to what new Wisconsin will be under Luke Pickel. He, of course, very optimistic it will be a seamless process. Time's going to tell on that. They are, Wisconsin's number 20.
Wasn't in year one.
No, it certainly was not, nor should anyone have expected it to be, I suppose. But Wisconsin checks in number 26 in Bill Connolly's SP Plus ratings over at ESPN. Penn State, of course, number 6 there. Interesting game on the road for Penn State, who will get its first true road test at USC 2 weeks earlier. It's at USC October 12th, bye week, at Wisconsin October 26th.
Yeah.
Penn State, of course, sometimes off the bye can be a little bit tricky, and on the road in Big Ten play can be a bit tricky. So we'll see how that one plays out for Penn State. But, overall, I look at this schedule, T. Frank, and I guess I'm going to do a little bit of a off-the-wall transition here. But when you talk about this Wisconsin team and you look just across the Big Ten overall, I think to the point, I believe it was Robert Sherrill made a short while ago back over in the comment section, but there are a lot of teams, and Wisconsin's one of them, who are changing things, implementing new things in year 2 of a new thing. So, while we sit here and talk about Penn State in a way that some of you might say, well, what about everybody else? It's fair, because there are teams, and the Badgers are one of them, USC is one of them, Washington's one of them. New coaches, new quarterbacks, new faces at key positions, injuries popping up that, are part of camp, things like that. All the things that we're talking about as it relates to Penn State, and not all those things in that list I just read do, but some of them certainly, I think apply to teams across the conference, and it can be easy to forget that. But, certainly the Badgers are going to try and have a better 2024. Also, to me, one of the teams on the schedule who, if things go according to plan for Penn State, they're going to be probably a double-digit favorite against, even on the road.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I think are important about why that is, too, because what they're transitioning into, as somebody said, air raid Wisconsin is weird. Yeah, they're an air raid offense, essentially. Tom Mason makes a great point. They led all Big Ten teams, and I'm including the new Pac-12 teams here, all Big Ten teams in 3 and 4 wide receiver sets. So this is an offense that was used to playing 2 and now has to play 4. I'm sorry. I was just trying to look up the name of the Joseph Griffin Jr. is from Boston College, and I think they also had a transfer at wide receiver from USC. I was trying to find it quickly, but I can't find it right away, and that might have been something that was erroneous. But anyway, the transition to what they want to be is going to take more than 1 year because they need to get those guys into the building to play receiver, to get open in space that they're trying to create with these formations. And then from the offensive line perspective, they've imported some Cincinnati offensive linemen who fit the system and the scheme better, but and I'm not trying to be disrespectful here, I just don't know if they're Big Ten talent. So you look at what the offense wants to be and what it does. Penn State's defense under Tom Allen, running a 3-safety system, being more of that pure 4-2, that fits really. This is a matchup advantage for Penn State because they have more talent. It is more of a seamless transition because Penn State already was leaning that way with their body types that they have been recruiting. And they've got guys that are versatile enough to kind of fill in the cracks, right, and make up for any of those situations where maybe they need to have a little more help. So in this particular situation with Wisconsin on the road, I've seen a lot of people talking about this as, that's one they're going to lose because it's Wisconsin on the road.
Trap game.
It's like this team might not be any good. Defensively, they're kind of going in the same direction. They were a team that was playing a versatile front last year. And by the way, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, you can go in and see the video. I show you the video. I show you the offense is what we focused on the first time. But the defense, I left my notes there on the opening drive or two in the Sunday Film Study thread. This defense doesn't know what it wants to be. It's trying to be a multiple hybrid defense up front. They're trying to bridge that gap. Where are they in that situation of bridging that gap to being a more of a spread defense, trying to get into the modern game of football because they're also going to have to play Penn State and the Pac-12 teams and Purdue and all these teams that run these air raid or spread systems. So defensively, I'm almost as intrigued of what are they going to be this year and how are they going to do it? It's going to look very different, and I don't see that transition happening quickly. Speed is hard to get. That's what's I've said all offseason. Speed is expensive, and Wisconsin has not gotten the speed they need from what I've seen just in the quick transfer portal and recruiting overlook from 24 and from their transfer portal work in 23. So high level, Wisconsin, they're going to be a speed team. They don't have any speed yet.
Coming down the home stretch of this August 14 edition of the BWI Live Show. Thanks for being with us. T. Frank, any final thoughts on Penn State as preseason camp enters week number 3? You can join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com for $1, 2 months of access, promo code PSU1. It's $1 for 2 months of access, promo code PSU1. T. Frank, final thoughts on Penn State as week 3 of preseason camp kicks off.
Yeah, Duke here with the assist. C.J. Williams was the 4-star from USC that joined Wisconsin. So we'll have to see kind of what that is. But really, I'm just going to be focusing on the things we talked about here on the show today, going into some detail about those offensive combinations that I think can work, where the pain points might be, and how all of those fit together. I already wrote about that with just the receivers. Now I'm going to expand that, include the tight ends and running backs, because that's really what we're talking about. How are they going to fit all these pieces together? And if they go back to a 12 personnel or a 22 personnel, which means 2 backs, 2 tight ends, I don't know how that's going to work. And so I'm going to be looking at all of that stuff at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com.
All right. Well, that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. We will have much more over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Join us today. Thank you for being with us. Thursday, the Penn State BWI Live recruiting show returns. We'll have plenty of coverage about that and more as preseason practice continues. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Craig Pickel. We'll catch you next time on BWI Live.